Chi Ki Chiu Ashurasti. Turkey's diplomatic gambit, the Tehran summit that bypassed Washington. On the morning of February 7th, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's aircraft touched down at Tehran's Mehrabad airport at 9:23 local time for a meeting that the United States State Department learned about not through diplomatic channels but through Iranian state television broadcast 47 minutes after the Turkish president had already entered the Supreme Leader's compound. The meeting lasted 6 hours and 13 minutes. When it concluded, Turkey had effectively repositioned itself outside the American alliance framework that has defined Middle Eastern power architecture since 1979, and Washington had been reduced to monitoring developments through the same public sources available to any citizen with internet access. This was not a diplomatic courtesy violation. It was a structural realignment of regional power relationships whose consequences will compound regardless of how aggressively Washington attempts damage control in the weeks ahead. Subscribe to the channel right now and turn on notifications, because what happened in Tehran represents a fundamental shift in how America's oldest NATO ally conducts strategic decision-making in the Middle East. The pace at which Turkey is moving away from coordination with Washington means that the next development in this realignment will not wait for American approval or even American awareness. You need this analysis before the next phase of Turkey's independent regional diplomacy becomes visible through actions rather than just meetings. To understand the full weight of what occurred in Tehran, it is necessary to first understand what Turkey actually represents within NATO's defensive architecture, because this meeting was not simply a bilateral diplomatic engagement between two regional powers. It was Turkey signaling that its strategic calculations no longer automatically align with American regional objectives. Turkey controls the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits, the only maritime access points between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Approximately 48,000 commercial vessels transit these waterways annually, carrying roughly 3% of global oil supply and substantial percentages of Russian and Central Asian grain exports. NATO's entire southern flank defense planning assumes Turkish cooperation in closing or monitoring these straits during conflict scenarios. Turkey hosts Incirlik Air Base, which stores an estimated 50 B-61 nuclear gravity bombs as part of NATO's nuclear sharing arrangement. American intelligence collection operations throughout the Middle East rely on Turkish airspace access and signals intelligence facilities on Turkish territory. Turkey fields the second largest standing army in NATO after the United States, with approximately 355,000 active personnel and operational experience in Syria, Libya, and Azerbaijan that exceeds most European NATO members' recent combat exposure. That military, geographic, and strategic infrastructure represents the foundation of American influence across a region stretching from the Balkans through the Caucasus to the Persian Gulf. Turkey's value to Washington is not primarily economic or cultural. It is the physical geography and military capacity that American regional strategy has treated as permanently available resources since Turkey joined NATO in 1952. Erdogan's unannounced meeting with Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei signals that this assumption no longer holds. Turkey is not leaving NATO, but it is establishing that NATO membership does not automatically mean coordination with American regional objectives when those objectives conflict with Turkish national interests, as Ankara now defines them. The technical mechanics of how this meeting occurred without American awareness reveal systematic diplomatic preparation that began months before Erdogan's aircraft departed Ankara. According to sources familiar with planning discussions, Turkish and Iranian diplomatic teams conducted at least 7 preliminary coordination sessions between November and January, none of which were disclosed to American officials through the intelligence sharing protocols that typically govern Turkish engagement with nations under American sanctions. These sessions establish secure communication channels outside the monitoring systems that American signals intelligence typically employs to track Turkish government communications with sanctioned entities. The Turks utilize commercial satellite phone networks and encrypted messaging applications that do not route through infrastructure where the National Security Agency maintains collection access. Iranian counterparts employed similar operational security measures, creating a bilateral communication structure specifically designed to exclude American observation. The flight path selection demonstrates additional operational planning focused on limiting American real-time awareness. Erdogan's aircraft did not file a standard diplomatic flight plan through international aviation coordination systems. Instead, it filed as a commercial charter flight operated by a Turkish private aviation company, using call signs and transponder codes that would not automatically flag in American tracking systems as presidential movement. The aircraft flew a route through Iraqi airspace that avoided the standard diplomatic corridors typically monitored by American air surveillance operating from bases in Iraq and the Persian Gulf. This routing added approximately 47 minutes to total flight time, but ensured that American forces in the region would not receive automated alerts about Turkish presidential movement toward Iran until the aircraft was already on final approach to Tehran. The venue selection carries additional significance that extends beyond simple meeting logistics. Khamenei received Erdogan at his personal compound in northern Tehran rather than at the official presidential palace or foreign ministry facilities where diplomatic engagements typically occur. This location choice signals several strategic messages simultaneously. First, it demonstrates that Iran's ultimate decision-making authority participated directly rather than delegating to President Ibrahim Raisi or Foreign Minister Hossein Amir-Abdollahian, elevating the meeting's importance within Iranian power structures. Second, it creates visual imagery of a NATO member, head of state, being received in the private residence of the leader. American policy has designated as a primary regional adversary, imagery that broadcasts across Middle Eastern media markets with obvious implications about shifting alliance architecture. Third, it establishes that this was a meeting between principals discussing strategic alignment rather than working-level diplomatic coordination on specific bilateral issues. The meeting agenda, as subsequently disclosed through Iranian state media and confirmed by Turkish government sources, covered 4 primary areas that collectively represent a comprehensive regional cooperation framework. Defense cooperation discussions focused on Turkish acquisition of Iranian drone technology, specifically the Shahed 1 and 36 loitering munition system that has demonstrated effectiveness in Ukraine and Yemen. Turkey has developed substantial domestic drone manufacturing capability through Bayraktar and other programs, but Iranian systems offer specific technical advantages in electronic warfare resistance and cost-effectiveness that Turkish military planners have reportedly identified as gaps in current Turkish inventory. These discussions also addressed potential Turkish manufacturing of Iranian-designed systems under license agreements, creating defense industrial cooperation that would directly compete with American arms sales to regional partners. Energy cooperation represented the second major agenda component, with discussions centering on Turkish plans to become a primary transit hub for Iranian natural gas flowing to European markets. Turkey currently imports approximately 13 billion cubic meters of natural gas from Iran annually, despite American sanctions designed to limit Iranian energy exports. The Tehran discussions addressed expansion of this relationship to include Turkish construction of additional pipeline infrastructure and potential Turkish involvement in developing Iranian offshore gas fields in the Persian Gulf. European natural gas prices have stabilized between 35 and 42 euros per megawatt hour following the volatility that characterized 2022 and 2023. But that stability depends on diversified supply sources that currently include Russian gas flowing through Turkey. Turkish-Iranian energy cooperation offers Ankara the opportunity to position itself as the indispensable transit state for both Russian and Iranian gas reaching European markets, leverage that translates into economic revenue and political influence over European energy security. Financial system coordination formed the third component, addressing mechanisms to facilitate bilateral trade outside the dollar-denominated SWIFT international payment system that American sanctions have weaponized against Iran. Turkey and Iran conducted approximately $17 billion in bilateral trade during 2024, despite sanctions complications. but that volume operates substantially below the economic potential that geographic proximity and complementary economies would otherwise support. The Tehran discussions addressed establishment of bilateral trade mechanisms using Turkish lira and Iranian rial rather than dollars, along with potential integration of Chinese yuan-denominated transactions that would connect Turkish-Iranian commerce to China's Belt and Road financial infrastructure. These arrangements would not eliminate American sanctions pressure, but they would create alternative payment channels that reduce American ability to monitor and restrict Turkish-Iranian economic relationships. The fourth agenda component addressed regional security coordination, specifically Turkish and Iranian positions on Kurdish autonomous movements that both governments identify as security threats. Turkey has conducted multiple military operations against Kurdish groups in northern Syria and Iraq that Ankara designates as terrorist organizations connected to the Kurdistan Workers' Party. Iran faces similar security concerns regarding Kurdish separatist movements in western Iran and Iraqi Kurdistan. The Tehran discussions addressed intelligence sharing on Kurdish militant operations and potential coordination of military responses to Kurdish activities that both governments consider threatening. This cooperation would effectively align Turkish and Iranian security policies in ways that conflict with American support for Kurdish forces that served as primary ground partners in the campaign against the Islamic State in Syria. If this channel is providing analysis that explains mechanisms rather than just reporting diplomatic meetings, subscribe now and share this video with anyone trying to understand how regional power structures are shifting independently of American preferences. When the next phase of Turkish-Iranian cooperation becomes visible through actual policy implementation rather than diplomatic statements, when the economic agreements discussed in Tehran begin generating measurable trade flows outside dollar systems, when the defense cooperation produces observable military capability changes, the analysis will be here documenting what the developments mean for American influence in a region where the assumption of permanent allied coordination is breaking down. The economic consequences of Turkish-Iranian strategic alignment extend far beyond bilateral trade statistics and into the structural architecture of how American economic leverage operates across the Middle East and Europe. The mechanisms through which this realignment generates those consequences are essential to understanding why the effects will compound over months and years, rather than resolving through diplomatic pressure or sanction threats. Turkey's position as a NATO member conducting this level of cooperation with a sanctioned state creates immediate complications for American sanctions enforcement architecture. Under current American law, specifically the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act passed in 2017, any entity that conducts significant transactions with Iranian energy, defense, or financial sectors faces potential secondary sanctions that would restrict access to American markets and financial systems. Turkey as a nation-state cannot be sanctioned under these provisions in the same manner as private companies, but Turkish banks, energy firms, and defense contractors that facilitate the cooperation discussed in Tehran would theoretically fall under sanctions authority. The problem is that sanctioning major Turkish institutions would effectively sanction the Turkish economy, creating a direct confrontation with a NATO ally that hosts American nuclear weapons and controls critical military infrastructure. This creates what sanctions policy analysts call enforcement paradox, where the theoretical authority to impose penalties exists, but the strategic cost of actually imposing them exceeds any compliance benefit the penalties might generate. The result is that Turkey operates in a sanctions gray zone where American disapproval is clear, but American enforcement capability is limited by the strategic value of maintaining at least nominal alliance relationships. Turkish economic planners understand this dynamic and have structured the Iranian cooperation to maximize activity in this enforcement gap. The energy cooperation component carries particular significance for European natural gas markets and the pricing mechanisms that determine consumer energy costs across the continent. Turkey currently transits approximately 63 billion cubic meters of natural gas annually to European markets through the Trans-Anatolian pipeline carrying Azerbaijani gas and the Turk Stream pipeline carrying Russian gas. The additional Iranian gas discussed in Tehran would potentially add 12 to 17 billion cubic meters to this transit volume once infrastructure construction is completed, projected to require approximately 36 to 48 months. That additional supply would represent roughly 3% of total European natural gas consumption, enough to measurably affect market pricing during winter demand peaks, when supply constraints typically drive prices upward. The consumer-level economic impact of this supply addition would manifest primarily during winter heating seasons when residential and commercial natural gas demand reaches annual peaks. A 3% supply increase during peak demand periods would likely reduce spot prices by approximately 4 to 7 euros per megawatt hour, based on standard supply-demand elasticity calculations for European gas markets. For a typical European household consuming 35 megawatt hours of natural gas annually for heating and cooking, this price reduction would translate to approximately 140 to 245 euros in annual savings. Across Europe's approximately 200 million households that use natural gas, the aggregate consumer savings would reach approximately 28 to 49 billion euros annually. These savings would accrue to European consumers while simultaneously undermining American strategic objectives of limiting Iranian energy revenue and reducing European dependence on non-Western energy suppliers. The economic benefit to European households creates political pressure on European governments to accommodate Turkish-Iranian energy cooperation rather than supporting American sanctions enforcement, fragmenting the transatlantic policy coordination that American regional strategy assumes as foundational. The defense cooperation dimension introduces additional complications that extend into NATO's internal military planning and weapons standardization protocols. NATO member militaries operate substantial quantities of American-manufactured weapon systems and maintain interoperability standards designed to ensure that allied forces can coordinate effectively during combined operations. Turkish integration of Iranian-designed drone systems into its military inventory would introduce weapons platforms that do not meet NATO interoperability standards and that potentially incorporate technical vulnerabilities or surveillance capabilities that Iran could exploit during any future conflict scenario. The specific concern focuses on the electronic systems that control drone operations and process intelligence data collected during flight missions. Iranian drones would likely incorporate Iranian-designed software and communications protocols, rather than the standardized systems that NATO members typically employ. This creates potential for Iranian intelligence services to monitor Turkish drone operations, collect data on Turkish military tactics and target selection, and potentially compromise operational security if Turkish forces employ these systems during NATO exercises or operations where classified information might be observable through drone sensor systems. The manufacturing cooperation component creates additional strategic complications by establishing Iranian defense industrial capacity inside a NATO member state. If Turkey begins producing Iranian-designed weapon systems under license agreements, those manufacturing facilities would operate on NATO territory while producing systems designed by a nation that American policy identifies as a primary regional threat. This would effectively create Iranian defense industrial presence inside the NATO alliance perimeter, a development that fundamentally contradicts the alliance's defensive purpose and strategic orientation. The broader strategic question that emerges from assembling all of these elements is the one that American defense policy analysts and NATO strategic planners are beginning to ask with increasing urgency as the implications of the Tehran meeting become clearer. Can American alliance architecture in the Middle East and Eastern Mediterranean maintain coherence when its second most militarily capable member is pursuing strategic alignment with primary American regional adversaries? Or is the assumption that NATO membership guarantees policy coordination now operating on foundations that no longer match actual allied behavior? Turkey is simultaneously maintaining NATO membership, hosting American nuclear weapons, controlling critical alliance infrastructure, and conducting comprehensive strategic cooperation with Iran in ways specifically designed to exclude American awareness or input. That combination may represent the most significant challenge to American alliance management since France withdrew from NATO's integrated military command in 1966. But the Turkish situation is considerably more complex because France's withdrawal was explicit and formal, while Turkey is maintaining alliance membership while conducting independent regional policy that contradicts alliance strategic objectives. American policy responses to this challenge face constraints that limit effective options. Threatening Turkey with sanctions or alliance consequences risks pushing Ankara toward more comprehensive alignment with Iran and potentially with Russia and China, creating a complete strategic realignment that would eliminate American military access to Turkish territory and Turkish control of the Straits. Accommodating Turkish behavior establishes precedent that other allies could interpret as permission to pursue independent relationships with American adversaries without facing meaningful consequences. The middle ground of diplomatic pressure and limited penalties has already proven ineffective, as demonstrated by Turkey's decision to proceed with the Tehran meeting without American consultation. The most revealing data point may be the simple fact that the meeting occurred without American awareness until Iranian media announced it publicly. That development indicates Turkish confidence that American response options are sufficiently limited that Ankara can conduct strategic diplomacy with American adversaries without requiring American approval or even American advance notice. This confidence does not appear to be misplaced given American response in the 17 days since the meeting occurred. Washington has issued diplomatic statements expressing concern and disappointment, but no concrete policy changes or penalty impositions have followed. The gap between American rhetorical disapproval and actual policy consequences may be the clearest signal to other American allies about how much independent policy space now exists within alliance frameworks that were designed to enforce coordination. Here is where the complete strategic picture stands on day 17 following the Tehran summit. Turkey has established comprehensive cooperation frameworks with Iran covering defense systems, energy infrastructure, financial mechanisms, and security coordination. The United States learned of this development through public media after the meeting had concluded. No American sanctions have been imposed on Turkish entities involved in the cooperation. No NATO alliance consequences have been announced. European governments are calculating whether to support American sanctions pressure or accommodate Turkish-Iranian energy cooperation that would reduce consumer energy costs. Turkish defense contractors are reportedly initiating technical discussions about Iranian drone manufacturing that would begin within 18 to 24 months. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. When the first Turkish-manufactured Iranian weapons systems enter production, when the expanded pipeline infrastructure begins construction, when the bilateral payment mechanisms start processing transaction volumes that bypass dollar-denominated systems at scale, the analysis will be here. Evidence first, what it means for American strategic position always. Leave one question in the comments before you go. Can American alliance architecture adapt to members pursuing independent regional policies that contradict American objectives, or are we watching the gradual dissolution of policy coordination frameworks that have defined American global influence since 1949? Every response gets read and considered. This is the analysis that documents the gap between how alliances are supposed to function and how they actually operate when member interests diverge.